Okay, well, we'll get started. My name is Pierre Rochard. I'm the VP of Research at Riot. Today we're going to talk about proof of reserve. A little bit about Riot. Riot is the largest Bitcoin mine facility in the world, and it is based in my home state of Texas, and it is powering the time chain. So let's talk about gold, right? This is where it all starts. You have gold specie. People are spending gold coins in the economy. They're holding gold coins. There are no financial intermediaries. It's all peer-to-peer. You're just, 1 ounce gold coins or maybe even silver. And then because it's so inconvenient to walk around with gold and it's not very safe either, somebody can just steal your gold from you, perhaps you deposit your gold at a warehouse and the warehouse will give you a receipt, a warehouse receipt indicating that they have this amount of gold in their warehouse and you can come claim it at any time. From there, you have warehouses deciding that, well, maybe we could actually lend out some of this gold, or rather create more warehouse receipts rather than lend out the gold itself. So somebody will come to the warehouse and say, hey, can I have a receipt? I don't have any gold to deposit, but just lend the receipt to me and I will pay you back at a later point. And this is where the warehouse has created fiduciary media. So fiduciary media, you might also hear it referred to as fractional reserve banking, is specifically when the warehouse is creating more receipts than they have gold in their reserves. And what do they plug the hole in their balance sheet with? Well, it's a promissory note. It's a loan that they've made that is an asset to them, and it's a liability to the borrower. Okay, so full reserve with Bitcoin is a little bit different. So in this case, you actually don't have the money substitute, that is the receipts circulating in the economy, because Bitcoin is actually rather convenient to be able to transact with, whether it's over Lightning or on-chain. And it would be more inconvenient to use a Bitcoin substitute. So for example, let's imagine that an exchange decided to create a payment network that is proprietary that uses BTC as its unit of account. That would be extremely difficult for them to bootstrap. We already see that it's hard for Lightning to build up network effects. It's been hard for Bitcoin on-chain to build up network effects at the payments layer. And so, and not to knock on Liquid, but they've have had very little adoption. It's very hard to build up network effects for a payment system. And so to come in and try to compete with Bitcoin protocol by saying, hey, look, you're going to be sending BTC around, but it's proprietary, and you don't know what, it's a centralized SQL database. That seems unlikely to me. And when we look at the market today, we don't see any promissory notes or any kind of money substitute circulating in lieu of Bitcoin itself, as electronic cash circulating. So we have an interesting situation where it is actually the specie, the underlying asset that is circulating as money, but people do still use warehouses or third-party custodians to hold their Bitcoin, and they deposit and withdraw Bitcoin from the exchange. They don't deposit and withdraw a money substitute, right? They don't deposit and withdraw Binance Bitcoin or something like that, although I'll get into other issues of wrapping Bitcoin and all that, but neither here nor there. So the issuer's liability do not circulate as money substitutes. Now, we have seen fractional reserves with Bitcoin where the balance sheet of the fractional reserve bank is replacing the physical Bitcoin, right? Physical, what does that mean? Digital Bitcoin, but the real Bitcoin, the UTXOs, with a loan that they make to a third party. Now, interestingly, when they lend out Bitcoin to a third party, the third party would generally withdraw real Bitcoin. They don't withdraw a money substitute, which is very different from what we have in the situation with gold and with gold banks. This means that it's a much more fragile position than with a gold fractional reserve banking, because now a run on the bank happens much more quickly, as we saw with Celsius and other examples as well. There is no there's very limited ability to dilute, because the actual money substitute itself is not circulating in the economy. So there's nobody holding that on their balance sheet. Rather, they're holding real Bitcoin. And so in practice, we have examples even going back to Mt. Gox. Arguably was a fractional reserve bank because they had been hacked and they'd lost their real Bitcoin. And there were claims on Mt. Gox. Or people had Gox coins, and those claims never really circulated in the economy, in the Bitcoin economy. People just held on to them or sold them privately, but it did not turn into a money substitute. So that really speaks to the fact that using fractional reserve Bitcoin as a money substitute is far more inconvenient than using real Bitcoin. Okay, so that brings us to the topic of this talk, which is proof of reserves. There's a lot of different ways that people do proof of reserves. This is one way to do it. It's not necessarily the best way. I actually just had a conversation with the folks at Stack and Sats. They're doing it a little better, but I'll point out why. So the first is that the financial institution, or the warehouse, the depository institute, they provide a digital signature, or rather a set of digital signatures, using the same private keys that they use to generate the addresses that they received deposits onto, or that they have consolidated deposits to. And so this digital signature really represents that they are currently under control of actual UTXOs, actual real Bitcoin. And they provide that digital signature to a third-party auditor. Simultaneously, they provide a Merkle tree. So if you're not familiar with a Merkle tree, this is the same data structure or cryptographic structure that is used in Bitcoin itself, with transactions going into a block header. So the idea with a Merkle tree is that you have a hash of one piece of the data, one piece of the underlying data, and this is called a leaf. And then you combine these leaves into a tree so that you combine the hashes into one root hash that then represents the whole set of the hashes. And then you can use that after the fact to verify that your leaf is a part of the Merkle tree. So the exchange or the financial institution or the warehouse, they provide this Merkle tree to the third-party auditor. The third-party auditor will, first of all, take the digital signatures that they received and verify using their own node that those signatures actually are from the same addresses or public keys that were used to deposit the Bitcoin or consolidate them into UTXOs. And second, they will compare the total sum of the claimed UTXOs, all of the BTC on-chain. They'll add all of that up and compare it to the sum of all of the accounts that were provided as part of the Merkle tree, and then they'll make sure that either the UTXO amount is greater than or equal to the sum of the Merkle tree accounts. Now, this, if the third-party auditor just released an audit report saying, hey, look, these two amounts are equal, this would actually be a pretty good level of assurance as far as traditional audit goes. We'll talk about the limitations in the next slide, but this would be pretty good. Now, on top of that, the actual client can go to the website of the financial institution or the exchange or whatever it is, and they can get the leaf of their account, and they can take that leaf and go to the website of the third-party auditor, input that leaf into their interface, and then the third-party auditor will tell them, here's what amount the exchange told us you have in your account, and that went into our overall audit of all of the balances. And then you can take that amount and compare it to what the exchange is telling you is in your account or in your own records, ideally. And that will give you some level of assurance that at least your leaf was included into the set of the Merkle tree, and it provides some additional assurances there. Now, as you can imagine, this is operationally can be a heavy task to take on to put together this whole system, especially if you think about it from the perspective of a business. You might hear questions about, well, hold on, what's the return on investment of building up this software? Because there's no direct revenue impact. And there's an open question of how many clients actually care about proof of reserves. Some clients either don't know what it means at all, or they don't find that the assurances provided by proof of reserves are valuable relative to, for example, the brand value of the exchange or of the financial institution, or heaven forbid, they actually care about the regulators, and so they're like, well, this is actually a regulated entity, so I don't need to worry about proof of reserves, et cetera. But nevertheless, we have seen participants in the market offer proof of reserves to their clients, and it's an open question as to whether people are actually taking advantage of it and verifying their balances. Okay, so what are the trade-offs? Well, first of all, I'd say that on the right here we have using your Bitcoin node and your own private keys, and on the left is proof of reserves. But really, I would argue that using your Bitcoin node and your own keys, when you verify that the transactions you are receiving onto your own keys are real Bitcoin, you are essentially performing proof of reserves. You're just doing it in the best way possible, where you don't have to trust any third parties. And that represents really the, I guess I don't want to use this phrase, but the gold standard, the best assurances that you could have, the least uncertainty, and the most trust minimization that you can have. And so let's look at why that is. Well, first of all, typically the proof of reserves is done monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually, whereas your node does it with every 10 minutes on average, right? Every time you receive a block, you're able to have this continuous automated proof that your Bitcoin are still there on those keys or at those addresses. Second is the involvement of a third party. So the auditor could be corrupt, right? The exchange could bribe the auditor to provide false results, which would be bad. But in the case of running your own node, you don't even necessarily have to trust one particular node implementation. Perhaps you're a software engineer and you can write your own node implementation, or you can use the canonical Bitcoin Core C++ implementation and Bcoin JavaScript and the BTC D Golang implementation, and then you can compare all three, see if they give you the same results. On top of that, you can use old versions of all of these implementations. I've heard of people being able to run Bitcoin Core versions dating back to like 2011, 2013. So you could really take it to the nth degree and do code audits and all of this so that you don't have to trust all the developers. But the bottom line is that you are performing the audit with your own software. Third, The proof of reserves, when you're doing it with this methodology of providing a signature that is showing that you control these UTXOs, really the underlying assumption is that the UTXO is single signature. Now, if it's multi-sig, now you have to provide more signatures from more private keys, so you're increasing the operational complexity. And maybe you have multi-sig where the exchange actually does not control all the private keys for a quorum, which would actually be good for security. I mean, lots of caveats to that, but nevertheless, with proof of reserves, you're more constrained in how you can craft your scripts and your outputs. Whereas with a Bitcoin node, any kind of standard spending condition would automatically be picked up. And if you have non-standard spending conditions, then you know what you're doing, so you don't need me to tell you what to do. With regards to the private keys, this is an interesting problem, which is that, sure, maybe the exchange has the private keys, but what if somebody else also has the private keys? And they have not moved the Bitcoin yet, but they might at some point in the future. And so you don't have any assurances regarding that. If you're holding your own keys, you could actually move the Bitcoin to a new set of private keys, and assuming that your OPSEC is not completely wrecked, that your new keys would be unique and have not leaked. And you can use your own dice, your own deck of cards, generate your entropy. You could do it by hand if you know elliptic curve multiplication. Lastly, the custodian, and I think this is actually the biggest problem with proof of reserves, the custodian could have borrowed the Bitcoin. So if they borrow the Bitcoin before the audit, they provide the signature, the audit happens, and then they return the Bitcoin that they borrowed. One mitigation, which I find really interesting, which is what Stack and Sats does, is that they actually have segregated UTXOs for every account. And so if you went onto a block explorer or your own node, you could look up that specific output that is tied to your account, and presumably the amount in that account is unique enough that, and you would see the date, and you would correlate the date of the UTXO to the date of your purchase of those Bitcoin, and you would have some level of comfort that they did not borrow those Bitcoin 6 months ago in anticipation of a future audit. And then, of course, if it's your own node and your own keys, I hope that you are aware of whether you borrowed the Bitcoin or not. All right, do we have questions? I don't know if that was too fast or too slow, but I think we're on time here. No, everyone understands proof of reserves. Very good. Raise your hand if you run your own Bitcoin node. Excellent, excellent. Good crowd. No questions? Question over there.
Hi. Is it safe to say that proof of reserve is not the same as hack proof of defense that are basically on the subject? Yeah.
That's a really important caveat, that just because they have provided some evidence that they have your Bitcoin today doesn't mean that they'll have the Bitcoin tomorrow, right? They could get hacked. It doesn't speak to their security, other than the fact that, they have not gotten hacked in the past, and kind of Lindy effect of, well, maybe that means they won't get hacked in the future, which I don't think that is a good heuristic to adopt in this situation. I think that perhaps my biggest concern with proof of reserves is that it gives a false sense of security, and that people don't take it into account, the trade-offs involved between running their own node and holding their own keys and proof of reserves, because they're just looking at the marketing of it, and the trade-offs might be very nuanced and complex. So I think that to the extent that proof of reserves encourages people to hold Bitcoin at third-party custodians, I think it's a very negative concept, and maybe we should not have proof of reserves. The only counterpoint would be that some people are required to use a third-party custodian. In my mind, the solution there is that we should remove that requirement, but if that requirement is still in place, then proof of reserves is a great improvement over even traditional audit methods in the fiat world. My background is auditing, and in traditional audits, typically what you do is you would take a sample of the accounts and you would audit those, and then you would say, well, if the sample is good, then the population is good. So what's really impressive with software and cryptography is that you don't have to take a sample. You can take the whole population. And then with regards to verifying the population against what is on-chain, typically in an audit, in a fiat audit, the auditor would send a letter to the third parties saying, hey, is this correct? And they call these confirmation letters, and they're like physically mailed to a third party, which is just crazy. But with the auditor can run a Bitcoin node. They can, and the auditor's node is trust minimized in the same way that your own node is as well. So it's a big improvement, but nevertheless, I would still strongly encourage everyone to perform their own proof of reserves by running their own Bitcoin node and holding their own keys. And that I also think that if you are doing it carefully and perhaps following the instructions of a hardware wallet manufacturer, that in all likelihood your setup is as secure, if not more secure, than an exchange. The other problem with holding your Bitcoin at a third party is that you might think that you're doing away with the issue of holding a private key, but you're not. You're just changing the format of the private key, and you're changing it into a password and a two-factor authentication. Those are private keys as well, and you have to make sure that material remains secure as well. Otherwise, your account will get compromised, and they will drain your account. So arguably, keeping your Bitcoin at a third party increases your attack surface from holding one private key to holding three, right? One is the custodians, and two are your password and 2FA. So again, strong arguments for holding your own Bitcoin on your keys and verifying with your own node. Yep. Oh, is this the end? Or we've got one more question.
Hello, thank you. I have a question about how this works if you don't have segregated UTXOs, because it makes sense to me if you can look at your balance at a UTXO granularity. But if you have multiple clients sharing a UTXO, how do you prove this? And also, if we're not able to do that, how does this scale if not everyone is able to own a UTXO?
Yeah, great question. So really what's being verified is the sum total of the UTXOs controlled by the entity. And so indeed, with Stack and Sat's model of having segregated UTXOs, that probably doesn't scale unless we have some breakthroughs in cryptography, or even, I don't know, maybe it's possible with Taproot that you would be able to have a construct that would enable segregation in some way that is off-chain. But as it stands, it's either you're having to trust the auditor that they are verifying the sum total of the UTXOs against the sum total of the Merkle tree provided by the issuer or the exchange. But there's holes in this, so I definitely think that it's a trusted setup, and it's not ideal.
Hi. I got a question that's more of a side question. Since you've worked at Kraken, can you tell us a bit more about the private key management inside an exchange? Because they can show reserves, but what are the security measures that are in place for exchanges when managing private keys?
Yeah, let me see here. I've got the 24 words here. I'll just read them out to you. Thankfully, I do not know anything about the private key management at Kraken, so I'm grateful for that.
Last question.
Today, I believe the full balance need to be disclosed for the client to verify that their liability is included in the total balance, and it requires the exchange to, or whatever wallet using proof of reserve to disclose how much money there is in aggregate, and it creates an incentive to, if you go and you have a lot of money at stake, this is a very visible number, which I think is one of the reasons to not to use proof of reserve, right? It's because it's increase attention as the wallet you have, grows. How do you think about this particular issue?
Yes, so while the individual balances in the Merkle tree are anonymized, so that the auditor doesn't know the client's identity, there are privacy problems throughout this setup. I think that from a privacy perspective, you're doxing all of your coins, or the exchange is doxing all of its coins to the third-party auditor, but it's not doing it to the clients. So the clients wouldn't know the sum total. Only the third-party auditor would know what the sum total is. I mean, in a classic scenario. Now, if it's a publicly traded company, then they have to disclose that in their financial statements anyway.
How big of a problem do you think fractional reserve Bitcoin is right now?
Well, I don't think it's a very big problem because when it is a problem, it's very short-lived, as we saw with Celsius and Voyager and Mt. Gox. So I think that it gets. I think the bigger problem is that it gets reframed as being a positive of, hey, look, earn yield by lending your Bitcoin to this fractional reserve entity. And then, the bank run happens and the entity goes bankrupt and you get, 0.5 Bitcoin for every 1 Bitcoin you had deposited, or at best, right? Like you're getting a big haircut. And so the idea of putting 100% of your Bitcoin at risk to earn 4% is insane to me. And I think that it speaks to the great marketing from all of these companies that people have been doing this. But I think that's the bigger issue, is the people trying to turn this terrible model into a business. And as we've seen over the past cycle, that it's very short-lived. But I think that it will continue to happen. So I think that we'll continue to see platforms that offer yield on fractional reserve Bitcoin emerge, and then when things go south, they will collapse, and people will learn their lessons the hard way, unfortunately. But then they will become toxic maximalists who hold their own keys and run their own nodes, and who are performing their own proof of reserves and not taking on unnecessary risk.